going to get started because we have a hard stop at 7 for our staff dialogue to start then. So I'm going to call the meeting to order at 6:01. And we have Chris as our minute taker. At this time, is there any public comment? We have no public in the room. Is there anyone on Zoom who wishes to make a public comment? You want to raise your digital hand? Brenda.
It's just a sort of general comment, or general concern. If the board has small group discussions or discusses questions using a pair and share process, how is this, can this be made available to those of us who are Zoomers? And if it can't be made available to us, does it fulfill the open meeting law?
So we'll likely be in breakout rooms, and if you'd like to join a breakout room when we do that, just raise your electronic hands and somebody will put you in a breakout room so you can hear the conversation.
Okay, so you've thought of that. Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, if I could just also add, Brenda, that after each session of breaking out into small groups, the whole group is going to convene and share reflections, so everybody will be able to access that part as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
All right. Any other public comment? All right. Moving down to the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So move. Krista?
Krista? All right. Steve, is that you as a second?
Yep.
All right. All those in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, the motion passes. And it looks like Liz has joined us online. All right. Oh, there's Patrick. Oh my goodness. Patrick, we have executive limitations monitoring and update the financial report. If anyone has any questions, Patrick's available.
Patrick, I had one question for Floyd. I know he's not here tonight. I don't think.
No.
Just curious about the career change incentive budget. So there's, it looks like it's about 55 in the red right now. And was just curious, that seemed to be one of those budget items you'd think you'd have kind of a set projection for. And I don't think we approved any in this last budget. I'm sort of curious why that's running over currently.
Yeah, I don't have the details on that. You're right. We didn't approve any career change incentives for this year. So anything that's there would be from prior years because it is a multi-year commitment financially, depending on what option someone takes in that. If you could just email Floyd and I that question, we'll get back to you on that.
All right.
Any other questions regarding the financial report? All right, moving along. Update is a policy 2.8, communication and support to the board regarding hiring. Patrick?
Yeah, I just wanted to take this opportunity to touch base with the board and acknowledge the unusual hiring circumstances that we find ourselves in. You're seeing a lot of positions come through with resignations in the consent agendas. The high number of people leaving positions in education, certainly we're seeing that in MAUSD. It really is a state and national phenomenon that we're seeing. Just the assumption is coming out of COVID and the challenges that have been associated in educating children during that time, and the stresses put on educators is contributing to that, coupled with the job market being what it is, that there are so many jobs across so many sectors that opportunities are pretty abundant right now. So you're definitely seeing what we're feeling as folks are leaving, and we're working hard to replace these many different people. The reality is there aren't people waiting in the wings to take a lot of these jobs. So we're seeing smaller applicant pools while having far more people leaving. And that reality is going to kind of hit us as we work through this hiring season and we land wherever we land with our ability to fill positions. So fortunately, we've done a lot of work in recent years, in particular on the professional staff compensation package. So that helps us to be as competitive as we can be. There's a lot of work happening right now on the support staff side to try and keep pace. So we have done and we continue to do the work that will become even more important to attract people. Having said that, the amount of uncertainty that we have with all of the work that's underway and towns looking to leave, et cetera, doesn't help us. And we are definitely experiencing some of those challenges right now. We just had an admin meeting today where we talked about some of the challenges we're having with hiring. We have some positions, multiple positions that have been posted for a while now, weeks, that don't have a single applicant for them. So just wanted an opportunity to just make the board aware of that, share those concerns, and we can keep you updated as we get, toward the end of the school year when, the dust has somewhat settled on this, and we can kind of let you know what we've been able to fill, what we haven't been able to fill, and kind of let you know what our game plan is to plan accordingly with the staffing that we're going to have for next year.
All right, any questions? All right. Moving along, we have an action item to accept the monitoring report for 2.1 treatment of current and prospective students and parents guardians.
So moved, Krista.
I second.
Sandy? All right. Any discussion?
I have a question.
Sandy?
Patrick, in the section on, sorry, I just pulled off the page. It is the section that says not to elicit information for which there's no clear need, which is on page 3. And it goes to the enrollment forms. One question I have is, I see that the forms require still Social Security number as part of filling the form, but I believe that that's no longer required. So I'm not sure, I'm wondering if just for privacy interests, if that's something that the administration could consider not putting in if it's not required.
Yeah, I haven't heard any change to that, but it's something I'll look into to see if that is required or not. And if not, we can then consider whether that's necessary.
Thank you.
Krista?
Yeah, I was looking, and I filled out the worksheet, and I'm not sure how best for the board to grapple with this, but what I was interested in talking about is, are there ways we might refine this policy or the interpretation to include the encouragement of stakeholder input into conditions that could be deemed inequitable, unsafe, untimely, undignified, unnecessarily intrusive, that section, and then also in the section about accessibility and privacy. So my interest really is in I think trying to find ways to center the voices of folks that might be marginalized in our community. And a way to do that is to invite them to have a voice at the table around what happens in our schools. And this policy seems like it could offer that opportunity to ensure that we, we only know what we know from our own experience, so what might seem equitable and dignified and accessible to us may not be to somebody else. And so I suggested that there might be a way to tailor either the policy language or the superintendent's interpretation to include something along the lines of, like for that first one, potentially add and do not, and so everything's in the negative, so it's tricky, but I guess we would say something like we would not allow these conditions to occur without also providing opportunities for stakeholder input. So I don't know if I'm articulating what it is I'm trying to say, and I also look to you, Don, to help with where that goes. But, like I know we have handbooks and we have all those things which are really great. I think what I've always been really interested in seeing our board do is to just, as we do with community engagement, to encourage our superintendent and our administration to also seek out that input and to show evidence of that input, and especially around these sorts of things.
I have some thoughts on that, Don, if that is appropriate.
Sure.
When I think if that is something that the board wants to see, I think writing that into policy is the best way to ensure that it happens. And when I think about just sort of the mechanism for that and the process around that, it would be typically immediately following a monitoring report. If there is a policy change that seems appropriate, that policy change discussion would happen just after. So I think if that is something that the board wants to take on, I think now is a great time to bring that up, Krista. And then if there's consensus with the board to go in that direction, then that gets on a near future board agenda for discussion, adjust the policy language and go from there. In the event we did have a policy committee, it's something that could get kicked to the policy committee to kind of work around and bring back to the board. But from a process standpoint, now is a good time to start thinking about making that change if that's what the board wants to see.
And my thought was that the language around stakeholders really is in the board, more in the boards A3 and A4. You see more talk of the stakeholders, and I would really want to go back and look through all of it at once and see if that's the place for that language to be, because policy governance is based on the premise that the board is the bridge between the stakeholders and the organization. So is it better to define it there, or is it better to define it in this policy? Is what first came to mind when I saw your worksheet. Krista.
Yeah, I had that. I was thinking about that, but then I was thinking, well, operationally, like this deals with like operationally how our administration deals with families and students, and so I think it's different. Like our engagement as a board is around the future direction of our district and to make sure we have the input of our stakeholders in that future direction. But I think I would also really be interested in us talking about whether we'd like to see our administration also have commitment to stakeholder input in their you know what word I'm trying to say. The way they operationalize what happens in our schools.
Right.
So that was where I thought this might also be important to codify.
Mm-hmm. Steve?
Yeah, I think what Krista's talking about is actually changing what we would want to see for evidence.
Right.
Because it's definitely talking about, this particular limitation is talking about the superintendent's direct relationship with students and parents. So that's really his purview.
Right.
It's not really the board's purview to get in the middle of that relationship necessarily. But I think we could certainly ask for evidence that the people who are on the other end of that relationship provide perhaps some evidence that they agree with the superintendent's interpretation.
Sandy?
And I apologize, I was scrolling through the document. Which number exactly are we? I just want to make sure I'm looking at the right one as I was scrolling.
So I think it's
It's the top of it.
It's the
very
first-
top,
yeah.
that first section,
First paragraph.
first
Yeah.
paragraph, and then again, further down, number 3, fail to operate facilities with appropriate accessibility and privacy.
Gotcha. You know, I'm thinking about the policy governance procedure. I just wanted clarification on it. Thank you. And I actually agree with both of what Steve and Krista are both saying. What's interesting is that I think here, when we look at the report and we decide what we're going to accept or not accept, we actually, as a board at this meeting, do have a mechanism for saying, we're not ready to approve it because we want a different interpretation from the superintendent. Because you don't have to, because one of the vote is, do you accept the superintendent's interpretation of the policy? And then do you accept, I think, also the evidence? Am I right?
Yep.
Right,
Is
so-
it, you
Right.
answer, did you find that the interpretation is reasonable?
Right.
And does the data demonstrate the accomplishment of this interpretation?
Exactly. So they're the two parts. And so we do have a mechanism as we review these reports to say, I'm not prepared to vote, or I'm going to vote down because I want a better interpretation
Or better evidence.
or better evidence. But either, because both of those
The
questions are
interpretation
asked.
may still be fine, it may just be the
Right.
evidence might be.
Right, and when I was on the board before and I worked with the Policy Governance Committee with Patrick very closely when we were trying to work these policies with Val Gardner, one of the things that Patrick worked collaboratively with the board with when we were first doing these was trying to come together as a committee to come up with interpretations that seemed to be appropriate for the time. And so we actually collaboratively said, you know, Patrick would go and give an interpretation, the policy governance would give sort of their sort of sense of what they thought of it, and then sort of together made a recommendation or just a report to the whole board to say this is what we're looking at. So it gave good guidance to Patrick on interpretations. And that was something he was willing to do as the superintendent, to say, hey, I want to work to make sure that our interpretations are in alignment. And that's, if we did a policy governance committee, I could see, you know, doing that kind of work at that level. Because the only other way then to deal with the evidence and the interpretation is right now just to be clear about what direction and to move to accept or not accept or to vote it down, but not to say that means it'll completely get it, means we want to rewrite on X section and then come back with a new report, which can be very time consuming for the superintendent, which is why that separate policy governance work was useful, because then it allowed the superintendent to just know what he was preparing for and knowing that it was current and sort of what the board was seeking. So that may just go back to the list of, you know, whether we want to still consider a policy governance committee to, as these things may add up and we're approving reports, it might be more efficient in a way of proactively doing this instead of having to do it the other way. Does that make sense? I mean,
Yes, but
yeah. So that
I have
we can
another
make a-
thought, but I
Okay,
don't
please.
know if anybody else was.
I'm a little confused. Are you alluding to changing it retroactively or going forward?
No, I mean, you, like when we did the ends report, like when I did my ends report and I looked at the other ones, there was a vote at one point where the board said, we can't accept this, we want you to rewrite, you know, one section because we don't find it acceptable or enough, and then he did, and he did a whole addendum, this is some years ago, and then the board passed it because they received more information, right?
But that wasn't a change of policy, and it wasn't a change of interpretation. It was just a change in the evidence.
True.
And
So,
I think that might be what Chris is actually looking for here.
is it interpretation?
I'm not sure from reading this that the policy or the interpretation are necessarily need to be corrected. But
Well, I have a thought on that, but I was,
But what we see for evidence might want to be adjusted.
Patrick?
Yeah, and this is great conversation. For me, where my mind goes, I'm not sure the policy really explicitly articulates stakeholder engagement and the importance of stakeholder engagement. And so I think to request different evidence when the policy doesn't speak to it, we're kind of missing that part, right? That's why I recommended, if this is something the board wanted, that it look at changing the policy, because the best way to ensure it going forward, myself, future superintendents, future boards, is if it says in the policy somewhere very explicitly that stakeholder engagement is important, which it currently doesn't, I don't think, then in order for my interpretation to be deemed reasonable, I would have to speak to how I interpret stakeholder engagement. And then it's reasonable to expect evidence that addresses that component of the policy. In the absence of language in the policy that says that, to deem an interpretation unreasonable when it's not spoken to in policy and then ask for evidence, seems like we're missing that sort of key kind of leading feature, which is the policy language. So that's where, for me, I think procedurally having the conversation about a potential policy change following this monitoring report for future monitoring reports seems like the best way to ensure that that happens going forward.
Krista?
Yeah, that is exactly what I was thinking, because this has to sustain beyond Patrick. And also because we don't want to wait to then say the interpretation isn't what we wanted or the evidence isn't what we wanted. We want our leader to know what we want and be able to deliver that. But in the interest of time, I suggest we revisit it, like Patrick is saying. You know, we'll figure out when the next time is to have that conversation, if everyone agrees, because these are just my comments, but I hope folks agree that we can talk about it again.
So I didn't come back around, and I apologize, because when I asked what section you were looking at, I thought you were talking about section 5, which is page 7 of the report, because I thought that spoke to specifically the policy actually reads, fail to inform students and parents, guardians of this policy, or to provide a way to be heard for persons who believe they have not been afforded a reasonable interpretation of this policy. Now, that I think is a little different than the stakeholder piece, but I did think the interpretation was interesting because it's really just about giving policies and appeals. But I thought that might be an area that could also expand. Is that really sort of the interchange that we're looking for? Isn't just appeals when they feel like things aren't being followed, or is that something that could also expand communication that falls within the policy? But I'm happy to table it and discuss it again later.
Should we do like a thumbs up?
Well, I know Kevin filled out a worksheet as well, so
Oh,
I want to
okay.
give him an
Yep.
opportunity to.
Oh, mine was mostly procedural. I think from an audit point of view, there was quite a few appendices that referred to a handbook, and we are operating 6 schools. So by showing evidence of one, it doesn't necessarily, you have to assume that a given level of development is at the other 5 schools. So I think and like I said, this is procedural or from an audit point of view, if we're gonna have different policies at each school, it needs to be some sort of indication of that level across all the schools, or it'd be like one policy for everybody, so.
So,
It's just audit technique.
so what Krista was saying is there an interest in revisiting this policy at a future meeting? As a group, we have to decide that.
Sure.
All right. So I made note of that. All right. Now back to this. Do you have any more questions about this report? Okay. So based on the information provided in this monitoring report, does the board find that the superintendent's interpretation is reasonable? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Does the board find that the data demonstrates the accomplishment of this interpretation?
Yes.
Or no?
Yes.
Yes. All right. All those in favor of approving the monitoring report for 2.1, treatment of current and or prospective students and parents and guardians, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, Liz, I see you. Thank you. So it passes. All right. Okay. Moving on now to board management and governance. An action item to approve the monitoring report for 4.5 board members' code of conduct.
Can I move it if I wrote it?
You can.
Okay, so moved.
I second it.
Sandy. All right, any discussion? I have a,
Good.
all right. Just so that you all know, when you submit a worksheet, I attach that to the response form, so that becomes part of the record, so it's all captured that way.
I don't know how you do all that.
All right, and so I have Kevin's worksheet on that I'll attach. I'm not hearing any comments. So based on the information provided, does the board find that the board's interpretation is reasonable, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Does the board find that the data demonstrates the accomplishment of this interpretation, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
All those in favor of approving the monitoring report for 4.5 board members' code of conduct, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Right. We're a little ahead of schedule.
Oh, my goodness.
So,
Should we jump to other business before 7?
yeah, we can sort of work through, let's see. We could work on discussion of the retreat planning. So there was a list attached in the chair notes of anything, you know, of ideas that have surfaced over the last couple of months. Is there something that moves to the top for a majority of us that we'd like to definitely focus on at the board retreat?
Out of this list.
Out of this list, Kevin.
I don't know if it's a board retreat item or not, but the bird in my saddle is this whole ends policy thing. That we have an ends policy that, in my opinion, is a mission statement as opposed to an actionable policy, and I don't see any movement on doing anything with that.
Kevin, could you say that again for me? I'm sorry, I was reading it and then I missed the part.
I don't see in this list any discussion. I'm not sure that a board retreat, an organizational board retreat is the right place to do it, but I struggle with the fact that we have an ends policy that we all chew on and aren't happy with. And in my opinion, it's a mission statement more than an actionable ends policy. And we don't seem to get anywhere with talking about that.
I think the retreat is, this retreat, the summer retreat is the time to talk about that. The organizational one in March, typically we have so much work we have to get through just to set ourselves up. But really, August is the time because we spend a good portion of the day together and it's time to dig in a little deeper in conversation.
I'd like to add that then.
I think
Because
it
it
is.
is
there.
there.
It is. It's actually in here, but it's
Am I
under,
missing it?
it's under
Training.
training, which it also.
Policy governance.
Writing a
also is-
monitoring report, ends monitoring report, monitoring report, so it could be under that broad umbrella. But we could certainly focus some time on that ends monitoring report.
And well, and also the review of the strategic plan, I think, goes hand in hand with that. Because essentially, the strategic plan is supposed to be evidence
Yeah.
of meeting them.
Well, let's make it, say it then.
Or integrate it somehow. Well, I was just saying to Kevin, so I could say, it's just, it kind of goes again to revisiting the policy itself, the way the ends is written, and is there a way of crafting it so that it links these things more, so that they're, like you're saying, like, does it make, we can have a discussion about, should it include the strategic plan more tied to it, so it's more clear what evidence we're expecting, right? Otherwise, it is too broad, and it's such a huge, I know in doing the reports that we've had, it gives, I feel like we could give more direction, and I think it would assist more in terms of us feeling satisfied with the information we get, and it would help give clear guidance for our superintendent.
Is this the opportunity to offer additions or suggestions, or are there?
For the retreat, yes.
Or I guess what I'm saying is this the sole opportunity?
Well, in order to organize and get, if we need help with training, or we need somebody to come to talk to us, we gotta start planning ahead of time, so
Understood.
we try to set time now to start identifying some things that are pretty high on our list that we really want to get to, and then we go out and see if we can find people to help us with it, kind of thing. So definitely, if you have ideas, because not everybody answered that poll at the time that I wrote this, and I haven't had a chance to go back since we did the agenda a week or two ago. So if you
I
have
don't
an
have
idea.
anything burning, I'm just wanted to,
Right, and sometimes there are things that we might identify throughout the year that become more pressing, that we say, okay, we're gonna block off some time to work on this. This requires attention now.
This looks like a perfect agenda to me.
It's pretty heavy though.
But we could certainly.
Each one of these could take a,
Right, but maybe it's not a deep dive into every one of them.
I would feel a lot more comfortable if the end policy was standalone as opposed to buried in another role.
that was me. I had this, sorry, Krista, it's my turn. Yeah, I had this compulsion to like try to, bucket things, and that was like the policy bucket. But one thing I was just wondering is, how do we see the retreat? Is it like setting the course for the year? Is it future, vision oriented? Is it board member training? Is it a combination of both? Because I think it's a unique time that we have together where we're not doing board business, but we can't cover everything during that time. We do sort of chip away at some things over the course of the year. But it's a time when we can do a more deep dive into something big that would be hard to do during our regular work cycle. So I don't have a particular topic that I would say, yes, this, not that, but I'm just wondering if that's a way to think about how we use our retreat time together.
Kevin?
I would suggest that we stay strategic and develop visionary, strategic sort of things. Things, in my mind, things like training could very well be carried out in smaller bites throughout the year, quite handily, as opposed to trying to bog down that day and give that day some time to really be strategic about. Because we lose that when we come into these meetings.
Okay, well, the other thing that, like I keep saying, like, if we can find people to help us, that plays, if we can find somebody who can help us on this, but we can't find anybody to help us on that, then that's where we start jockeying things around. Patrick?
Yeah, so the notes I've taken down, and I agree, we already have the makings of a pretty full retreat agenda. But I have Kevin's point about looking at the ends and thinking about it in a more actionable way rather than sort of the mission statement way that he sees them written now. And to Steve's point about a review of the strategic plan, which really is sort of the actionable plan related to the ends. And so the linkage between those two becomes really important. I think one thing just to be aware of, conversations about the ends policy, if that leads to a change in the ends policy in August or September, the ends monitoring report that you would see in October would not reflect those new changes, right? Because we're gathering that information now. So we'd be looking at future ends monitoring reports that would reflect any adjustment. So just to put that out there as folks are kind of wrapping their mind around it. I also added something that's very related to that work that I think is important to have an understanding of, and something we talk a lot about, but it's our multi-tiered system of support, which really speaks a lot to Act 173, which is pretty significant. So those are some other components that we could weave into that conversation about the system and the work underway and the work of the future.
Steve?
One of the reasons for saying we could touch base on all of these, whether they all have to be deep dives or not, but also I know new board members may not know anything about some of these topics, and just getting a kind of a brief current status kind of thing. Here's what this is, here's the current status of it, then move on, just to kind of get everybody up onto a level playing field.
All right, well, we'll begin to dig a little deeper and see what we can line up and spend some bigger chunks of time on some of the stuff that we can get deeper into. All right. Another update we have is the legislative update. And Dave is leaving us, but he is willing to continue on for a little longer as the VSBA representative. And I know that I put in the chair notes that maybe somebody else would be interested, and I thought maybe if there is another board member who's interested, they could, hear what you have done and the responsibilities you had, because when you leave that position, then they look to our district to fill it with someone else. Is that correct?
So it's a regional representative. I don't know exactly how it works, to be frank. It could be anybody from any of the three districts in Addison County. Maybe even the Addison-Rutland district as well is in the region. So I don't know how that person is appointed or how I'm replaced. I have no idea. They said that decision normally would take place at the next regional meeting in the fall.
Okay. Kevin?
So I went in midterm and I was appointed by action. I don't know if it was by the whole VSBA board or by the executive committee to fill out the remainder of that term until the next regional meeting, and then I ended up getting appointed at that meeting through the meeting vote. So unless they've changed their strategy, I think that could very well be a possibility.
Well, they asked me if I'd be willing to serve, and I said that yes. But I'm also willing to step down if someone else wants to. I do have a couple of things that are relatively important. One is the weighting study that's likely to be passed by the legislature. So the VSBA is our influence in the legislature, and they work off of resolutions. And so what the resolutions are that are passed by the VSBA board are pretty important in terms of how they go about lobbying the legislature for changes in state law. The resolutions committee is going to meet June 21st. And if this board or anybody wants to introduce some resolutions, it would be good for the board to have a discussion about those resolutions. Maybe board members could be asked to submit suggestions, and then the board could have a discussion, and then those be submitted for review of the VSBA Resolutions Committee. It all seems rather sort of mundane and legalistic, but it is the basis for their lobbying over the next year. So if we want the state legislature to consider some change in state law, now is the time for us to put forward a resolution. They've been lobbying very hard around the weighting study, and it looks like at this moment in time that because it was voted out of the House Ways and Means Committee, that the weighting study will be an adjustment in weights rather than a complete overhaul of the funding system, which was proposed. But the Ways and Means Committee decided to go with adjusting the weights. The latest projection out of the Legislative Council and in collaboration with the Agency of Education shows Mount Abe's eventual increase in tax rates in our district if this bill were to come to completion, which right now it looks like it will, is in the range of 3 or 4% increase in tax rates, which is pretty modest. Does not take into consideration any continuing reduction in student demographics. So you have to look at that as an additional impact in our tax rates going forward. It does assume constant spending on a per pupil basis. So, you know, in light of what it's doing to some other districts in the state, we come out pretty easy. There are some districts, notably Winooski and Burlington, are going to see like a 23% decrease in tax rates in those communities. There are other communities that are going to see significant tax increases. And of note is also Addison Northwest, with whom we are having conversations about merging. It looks like their tax rate increase is going to be in the 6 to 7% range. I can send the entire table to anybody who wants it. Just send me an email and I can forward it to you. But that's the current analysis by the Legislative Council. So those are two pretty significant things that should be on our radar.
Right. Thank you, Dave.
Dave, when I was reading it, it sounded like they were also going to waive the spending threshold till like 2026. Did that follow through?
I think that's less certain, frankly.
Okay.
But yes, that's currently in the process. They are not mindful. They continue to be mindful of the fact that without a spending threshold, some districts who have relatively low tax rates and a high value for education are going to continue to push that high spending threshold, push their spending beyond the current high spending threshold, which will raise taxes for everyone.
Patrick?
One other important sort of piece to note in that legislation, I think, and Dave, you can fill in some of this too from your perspective. There's also a suspension of the hold harmless provision, which we've benefited from, which means that there's, so we've basically been given credit for our equalized pupil count that we don't have. And so that would go away, which would have an impact, a potentially significant impact on the cost per pupil and therefore the tax rate.
Yeah, so I asked that question, but I didn't get an answer yet as to whether these projections were based on the hold harmless provision going away or not. And that's a significant, could have a significant impact on what these projections are. I'll ask, as soon as I get that information, I'll forward it to the board members.
Liz?
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I'd love to have that chart. If you could forward it to me, I'd like to see that. And another thing that could affect us was the looking to continue the universal school meals that have been funded during COVID. And the two parts of that sounded important for us were that it sounded like the VSBA wanted to support that coming out of not out of the education fund, but out of the general fund, but still taxes, right? Either way. But so I think if that could be significant if it does. I mean, either way, it's significant, but it's really good. And I'm glad that everyone's supporting it, and I hope we do continue them, but that they were looking to get a new form out to families, another way to collect information so that they can know what the numbers are for getting like students that are in poverty, etc. So that was some other new stuff too.
So my understanding is, and Patrick, maybe you can confirm this if you know, that the full meals will be extended for 1 year, paid for by federal money, and the bill that Liz was talking about has been changed to a study to find sources other than the education fund to pay for it going forward.
Okay. All right. Wow.
So maybe we could take 5 to kind of connect with Elizabeth and Sarah and figure out.
So we have a little extra time, so if people want to take a quick function break and just be back in the room and ready to go promptly at 7, we can do that. If you're on Zoom, just hang out. We're going to, work through a little meeting process, and then we'll be ready to go right at 7. Okay?
Yep, and muted, right.
Okay, so for the folks that are online, you should have been assigned to a Zoom room, and we're going to put everybody in those rooms now, and that includes guests. So if you are just a visitor, you're welcome to join and listen in, but those folks who will be in conversation will be staff members and board members, and there should be a good mix of people. Each room has 2 to 3 people in it. And before you go into, and then there'll be people joining from this physical space into the virtual rooms. So before you go into your room, just a quick kind of instructions on what we're going to do. So from now until about 7:15, you're going to be in your group and just talking through the document that we shared on policy governance. So one of the things. Oh, we haven't done our intro.
No, we haven't. You're
Okay, so I better just stop right there, because I think we might be in where we need to be. But before you do that, we're ready to move into that part of the meeting.
Right. So
Okay, I'm going to get out of the way.
you were just jumping the gun.
Oh, yeah, I'm action-oriented.
So Elizabeth and I were going to have a little intro time. Tonight we're coming together again to build on the original first meeting we had, and to have time to listen, to share, and understand things a little deeper and learn a little as we go, kind of thing. So,
I just wanted to say that we really appreciate this, that we're getting it going. We love the idea and look forward to next year where we continue it 3 times a year, and really want to recognize too that it'll be a process. We're just starting it and kind of figuring it out, and that I'm sure we're gonna grow in how useful it is, and just figure out how how to make this really helpful for all of us.
yes.
Now, and I want to say one other thing, which is that our hope too is that as we maybe identified something we wanted to share, or the school board did, that, we'll choose what will be the topics for each of our times going forward, which I think we already talked about. And we really hope that the staff who come will rotate, and it will be both people who are a part of our association and other staff members too. So that there'll, different people will show up each time to be a part of this process.
Nice. All right. So that pretty much explains the meeting purpose. So the agenda review for tonight is we're going to provide an overview on policy governance, and then a little later gather thoughts from the staff and questions about the Levinson report that the summary was included in the agenda. So the last thing we want to do is go over some meeting norms, sort of how we're going to behave today and tonight and moving forward. So all ideas get a fair hearing. Each person in your group gets a chance to talk. I don't know if you want to go with the last two, or?
Speak for yourself. Don't try to speak for your group. It's okay to disagree, but don't make it personal.
Okay. And now Chris is going to lead us in.
Okay.
Here you go.
Thank you. So so first we're going to spend some time in small groups talking a little bit more about policy governance, which may be new to folks or might be just like a constant learning for some of us. So you have a handout that we provided. I just want to note that it was excerpted from another school district, and the last paragraph talks about goals for the school board. That's not our school board, but everything else I think does give a good sort of basic summary of what our board governance structure is, and hopefully will help frame how we continue to work together. So we'll go into your small group and talk together about thoughts or questions you have about what you read, and then we'll come back to the larger group. We'll have about 15 minutes to do this. When we come back to the larger group, I'll be taking notes on a Google Doc that we'll share out after. We'll try to answer questions that might come up about policy governance, but they might just be wonderings that we want to explore another time. And then when we come back, we'll as Dawn said, we'll dive into the summary from the new Solutions K-12 report. So let's start at 7:10, and I'm just going to kind of float around and make sure people are where they should be and have a place to be. And again, if you're a visitor, you've been just randomly assigned to a room to join and listen. And if you're physically here, once you get into your room, you can just maybe find a place to sit, and only one person needs their device on. So let's see how this works. So Sean, you can go ahead and put people in their rooms. And I'm going to call on each group and then ask for someone to just share what you talked about. So, am I muted anymore? No. Okay, so it doesn't sound like we have any more reverb. Awesome. Okay. So why don't we start with group one, which was Dawn's group, and I'm going to take notes. So, hang on one second. Okay. So somebody from group one, which was Dawn and Patrick and some other folks whose names I don't have in front of me.
Patrick was in the group.
This Patrick. Patrick Lawrence. Okay, so can someone from that group share? And I think maybe it makes sense for you to come over here and share this way, since everything's turned off on your sound. So you have to elect someone to come over to the mic. Team approach, that's awesome.
Probably somewhere just within range.
Awesome. Okay. And so you guys are kind of talking. Everybody should be able to hear you.
Sure.
When you're talking. So tell us about your conversation.
Just an overview, I think, for people.
Yeah.
So we were just discussing about, most of our discussions revolved around it's kind of when there are observations within the school system, at perhaps a teacher level or at some kind of staff level, how that percolates up to the board, and then the division of how that goes through the principal, superintendent, and then if it's relevant to the board, then they get reported to the board, and how that flow of information can or cannot occur, or does not occur, and any potential issues with that. So I'll leave you to elaborate on.
Right. Well, so Don talked about that the board was trained with the cake analogy.
Can you just tell us what the cake is? I think I know what it is, but.
Right, so the idea that if you want to order the best cake, you don't want a lot of people kind of telling everyone, well, but this is the best flour, and you should do this, and you should do this step, and you should, right? So that the idea of policy governance is letting the baker bake the cake. And so then some of the criticisms of policy governance, which I feel get in our way sometimes, is that we then have the baker report back, one person reporting back, that this is the best cake ever. And so there isn't, the idea of policy governance is to have policies in place so that the board can, or the people can get information and data from not just the baker, but there's a policy about where the data comes that's very multifaceted and flows through that one person, the baker. But it's the policy that the board is going to be focused on, so they're not micromanaging the baker. Hopefully that makes sense.
Any comment or ask questions? Or no?
Let's just report in right now. But anything else from group one? Okay. Group two was Aaron, Dave, Michelle, Brent.
So we gave a basic overview of what policy governance was, and then we talked about the structure, sort of similar to what group one did, and what the board's role is compared to what the superintendent's role is. We talked about differences in how boards manage or employ policy governance and how we use it. And then there were some specific questions about how do policies change. And so we kind of did a little bird's eye view of that, what that looks like. And then we had a brief discussion about how policy governance is working for us as a board and as a district. And so we discussed the nature in which some of the policies have been changing and evolving, and the discussions that have been brought up recently on those different topics.
Anything else from your group? Good? Okay. And then group three was Kevin and Elizabeth and Sarah, this posse here.
Somebody want to come up with me? Kevin, do you want to come up?
Sure.
Should we sit here again?
Sure.
That's great.
Well, we started just asking, as the teachers asking some questions about how it worked, and we discussed the idea that it's designed to make help the board to function more strategically, not necessarily getting bogged down in these very small issues, or if there's an agenda out there. And then some of the conversation that was around how that issue, some of the issues with it are connecting with all the stakeholders, that is sometimes can be problematic, and just how, and just I think we posed the question, how does a person or a group that has some questions or some concerns, how, are the avenues there for them to feel like they can get them addressed? That was, kind of one of the questions.
I think we also talked about the perception of policy governance. As a board, we're familiar with trying to be strategic, and there's a whole administrative function that's associated with policy governance, and depending on the issue that comes before the board, sometimes it's an administrative issue, not necessarily a policy governance issue. That gets really confusing to constituency in the fact that other governmental bodies quite often don't utilize policy government, for instance, the select board, and it gets really confusing as to the different tacks to address problems. We talked about a little bit about public comment, and potentially response to public comment in a meeting could veer off an agenda, and potentially it could be construed as a issue with not following the agenda. And then we also talked about the whole concept of communication and how to engage stakeholders successfully. That, you know, even though our specific board has a community engagement committee, it's awful hard to get a broad-based input, if you will, across all stakeholders. I think that is about it.
Sarah, did you have anything?
Good job.
Okay, thank you guys. So group 4 is Liz, Samantha, I'm not sure who, was there anybody here?
Me.
And Katrina?
Just me.
Okay, Katrina, do you want to?
Liz took the best notes ever.
Okay, so Liz, do you want to share your notes?
Yes, I appreciated our group very much. And I'm for policy governance, we definitely noticed the strengths in terms of what decisions are appropriate for board members and not, and how that makes sense and how it doesn't. And noticed some shortfalls, which is, you know, connecting, because just by nature, perspectives are different, and people who are in different roles throughout our school district are going to have a different perspective. And so it's important to address the shortfall of connecting and learning more about the staff experience. And there were actually a couple really great ideas about next steps, which I appreciated a lot, because I think we're recognizing our weaknesses, but then a couple of great ideas that I heard were if we had a policy governance committee, including staff on that committee, and having them be a part of that, and that would be awesome. And then remembering the strategic plan work and process that had begun before. And when that gets up and rolling again, there were board members, all different staff from all over the district, and there were students also involved in that process. So that was a really great opportunity as well. So I think those were two great ideas for moving forward. And I might have jumped the gun a little bit and started talking about the Levinson report and getting some feedback on that, but I think that's not the time right now to share that.
We had Samantha Kahart from Melanie in our group, and Casey was listening in.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay, group 5 was Sandy Lee, Simone. Did you have anybody else?
Susan Brule.
And Susan?
Mhm.
Okay. Are you okay to report in, Sandy?
I am. So, you know, we started with talking about communication and the flow of information from, in essence, stakeholders or those in the building, and how that information can get to the board, and how, whether it's perception or real, the gap between what happens in the school and what the board gets, and the sources that they get of information, as well as just sort of a disconnect that there appears to be between the two. There's discussion about, you know, so would that involve, you know, more reporting by in-school personnel to provide more direct information to the board, and how logistically would that happen, and what would be the structure for doing something like that. And that led us to a discussion of the ends in the strategic plan, and how that could be a sort of guiding document or touchstone for reporting and communicating together. So talking about how we think the strategic plan is being achieved or not, how you see things happening in the building, how that applies from the school board's perspective in terms of their work and policy. So maybe that could be a common ground, because that ultimately leads to the most important piece, is the ends. Are we really achieving the goals, that we say that we want for our students? And so just trying to figure out how to improve that information sharing. And the cake analogy that Group 1 had was really great, because what it made me think about is that the superintendent is the head baker, and the board imposes executive limitations, which are, you can bake this cake and we give you permission to bake this cake, but you can't do certain things. So it's got to be gluten-free, or it's got to be, like that. But these are the limitations that we've imposed upon you as policies. But as long as you don't break those baking rules, you can bake the cake. But what I think is interesting is if you only have, the board never gets to taste the cake, right? Yeah. Right? How do they know that it's good? Other than it's been told to them that it's good. But the only way sometimes they know is because a lot of people have told them about it, they've tried it, and they've given it a rating, right? Or so there are different sources of who's telling that the cake is good. For whatever the reason, if the cake is good enough, then that's sort of how we work as a board. If when everybody tastes it, for the most part, they say that's a good cake, then we've achieved our ends. So I do think it's necessary to figure out, how do we get more information about, is this a good cake? If we don't get to taste it directly. Yeah, just really good analogy. It was great.
Okay, and then we've got Group 5. No, that was Group 5. The final group, which was Steve and Katie, and I don't know, and Andrea and Deb. Would one or all of you kind folks mind coming up here to share your reflections?
Okay, we're mostly the Starksboro contingent, just saying. We had a really, first of all, I just want to say thanks. This has been just such a good opportunity. And I think we just had a really nice conversation about what is policy governance and what does it look like in this specific, experience. And I think I asked Steve a million questions about how long has he been on the board and how is it working and what are the strengths of policy governance and what's tricky about it, and do you feel like you're getting all the information you need? And we had a similar conversation. I loved the cake analogy, and that makes perfect sense, that add on to that. That's really helpful for me. And then Katie asked about, how do you know you're getting information from all those different contingencies? How about the folks, there are some folks who are really vocal, obviously. And then there's the folks who don't come to the town meetings, or don't come to the school board meetings, who don't come to the community engagement, even though they're put out there for a variety of reasons. And, I think, Steve didn't have the magic wand answer, but was like, we're reaching out, we're trying to make sure that we're including those. Just the conversation itself was really helpful. And I felt like it gave me a better understanding of what some of the advantages are. And I think it just puts some clarity around how the board works, and that it's not, there's no intentional putting up the wall. It's really, this is the way the system works, and the system is put there for a specific reason, and it's meant so that we're not delving into the minutia of what someone else is an expert at and should be doing them. So, what else is that good?
No, no.
Okay. Okay. So I think we heard from every group, and just before we move to the other topic discussion, does anybody have anything else? I've got these notes, and I thought I would share them with Sarah and Elizabeth so they can share them out, but are there any other reflections or comments or thoughts people want to make here or remotely before we go into another conversation? Cake, we want cake. We like cake. Okay, so this next section, you can go, do you remember who was where, Sean? No.
Just regroup us.
Yeah, so Sean's gonna, look at that.
Oh, they're still
Yes. Okay, so Sean's gonna put you in your groups again, and we're gonna have a little more time with this. First, let me just check in. We said 8:15. We've got 15 minutes to go. Are most people okay to go till 8:15, or do we have a hard stop at 8? Like, okay, 8:15, okay? And if you have to go, you can go. How about that? Okay, so we'll come back together at, like, I guess maybe 8:10 or 8:05. So go ahead and go back into your groups, and you can talk about the Levinson report. We have about 15 minutes to do our report back, but again, this is just what is really the beginning of more conversations. So keep that in mind. So group 1 was Dawn's group. Do you want to have your emissaries come up and share? What's that?
We were too busy talking to write anything
That's
down.
okay. You can just...
Yeah, I think we were just in general remarking on the amount of information in the report itself, and, a few bits and pieces of questions like, what does middle school mean, and where is this piece, and so it was more just sort of bird walking through the report itself.
Were there any particular questions that you want me to capture in the notes?
I think that one question that did come up was where the supervision and evaluation piece fits into Nate's sort of processes and outlines of things.
We also did talk about the cost, what does he say? Cost-effective mindset, and we just had some questions about what does that look like, and what are some possibilities in terms of people wearing multiple hats, roles of people of middle management, how that works, how a sister school works in a more cost-effective way.
Just speak up if you're going to be far away.
Okay, great. Group 2. That was you guys, yeah.
So we started with some likes, so things that we liked about the report, things that we thought made sense. So, streamlining in the district, having the cost-effective mindset seemed to be another thing something we focused on in our discussion. We talked about the middle management perspective, and how there are many people who may not necessarily work directly with kids all the time, and so if we were implementing a cost-effective mindset, that it would be great to have some transparency of individual coaches or interventionists who are more out in the open in classrooms, or even leading a class or an advisory, so that there could be some real utilization of their skills and experiences. And there was some discussion about ways to measure the success of the coaching model, and if there has been value added from that model. And we had several mini conversations about that sort of middle management idea that I mentioned. And then we also had a discussion about Act 46, because there was a question about why towns have to vote to close schools, and so we talked about the Articles of Agreement and how this board was formed. Those are the things we covered.
Thank you. Group 3. Who's group 3? Do you remember who you are? Okay. Group 3.
We're going to switch our speakers.
Okay. Awesome.
We started talking about the reasons, maybe 4. Did we start talking about? I guess we asked Elizabeth.
Well, there was discussion about.
I can think where we ended up.
I know we had a long discussion about the idea of would it be appealing to bring in childcare on site, and there were some thoughts. I know it would be fabulous for a lot of reasons, so many reasons. However, Patrick pointed out, he was a great resource and pointed out our sensitivity to not wanting to displace or put out of business existing private child care workers. If we were to suddenly take every 3 and 4-year-old in the district who need the lowest ratio of employees of staff to kids, that could effectively put private child care workers out of business. So for some logistical reasons, that maybe isn't practical, as appealing as it is to have.
But wait, I just want to say, but we did really talk about though that where the need is with the youngest children, and so we don't want to put any providers of 3 and 4-year-olds, but that could we fill a need in the very young, in the birth to 3 age group, and could that just have a benefit for our schools and our communities? So
we talked about at what point would schools really be too small to be, and what not. We didn't put a number on it. It was more of like, at what point would it actually not be a great place to learn, or a good, or a size thing, or efficient. We talked about different ways of achieving that monetary goal with like the percentage. Well, I forget what you called it, Kevin, or what the phrase was.
Oh, the weighted student.
Weighted student. Thank you. We talked a lot about the merger potential, and just what were some of the ideas. We really just like talked about the report. I don't know that we had a ton of questions yet, because I feel like we just have done it.
Yeah.
One question I had raised that Patrick was able to shed some light on is the report made it clear, I think it was a green light issue, the idea of moving 6th grade to middle school. It said it could achieve some of the identified goals and realize some cost savings, and it wasn't clear to me how does it accomplish all that. And I guess if I remember correctly, it had to do with having the most people of a certain age under one roof. You can utilize staff most effectively the more kids grades 6 through 8 who are together, as opposed to 6th graders being scattered. It changes a bit with the upcoming different configuration of middle school with fewer teams than there have been, but anyway, hypothetically. That's pretty much it, I think. What did we forget?
Well,
thanks.
I don't know that.
Great. Okay, group 4. That is Liz and Samantha and Katrina. Hi, go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, so we we talked about challenges, tough choices, change is stressful, and our challenges are stressful that we currently have as well. Hopes to address declining enrollment, address financial challenges, class sizes at the high school level, and just thinking about how some of the questions are, of course, around what a cost-effective mindset looks like, and we have worked with the DMG and the DMG reports and with teams already. That work has happened in our district to look at people wearing multiple hats and how to distribute the workload frankly, among everybody and meet all the needs. And looking at, we ended up talking quite a bit about EST, right? And knowing teachers needing to know, how students are identified and what services are offered. And that, of course, brought right in Act 173, which changes that, and hopefully for the positive. And the interaction between the tiers of MTSS, and about how some of the different grade levels in our district, elementary, middle, and high school, are at different points in developing that and utilizing the tiers of support. Because this all, to me, I think that comes with thinking about cost-effective mindset and possibilities that came up in our group. So I say, and questions. So that was more questions about buses and shifting roles and interaction between the tiers of MTSS. And possibilities for us where we were looking at closing the financial viability of closing schools versus repurposing, and the use of resources, and moving sixth graders came up in our group as well. And I think that it's really just kind of all rolls back around to the beginning about challenges and tough choices and change. And there's stress right now. And even though change is stressful, what are we really going to do to address the challenges that people are facing?
Thank you. Okay, group 5, Sandy, Simone,
Susan.
Susan,
Just
and did Brad?
Brad came,
and
Brad
Brad
was there too. Brad was there too. So we read through the summary, and I think we started out just with clarification that talks about the next steps in the report, that the board had already actually taken action, in essence, on options 1 and 2 by, directing Patrick to develop a structured and facilitated process to explore more deeply the cost-effective options about an autonomy, because we were looking to keep open all our small schools. So that process is currently happening. We discussed about how that is already on its way, and that next board meeting, as indicated in this summary, it's anticipated to have a report from Nate Lemonson on that. So, knowing that that was something that the board had already moved on options 1 and 2 by choosing to explore a cost-effective mindset, we then jumped to number 4 option discussion about the 6th grade. Good question. Same as another group of, what does that really mean? In terms of which criteria is it meeting? Does it mean, and there was a discussion about the efficiencies of curriculum, which was really interesting in terms of the benefits of a 6th, 7th, 8th middle school. But we also spoke about how it is a pretty controversial subject, and people think very differently on the pros and cons of moving 6th grade. Discussion of, middle school, traditionally, there's a lot of benefits from a 6, 7, 8, but we don't have a true, as it is now, just middle school. It's still linked to a high school. So there are definitely concerns I can see from parents. My 6th grader may be mingling more with high schoolers. And so it's not like you just have 6th and 7th, 8th graders. So again, definitely something that is a next step. I could see, we wondered about when and at what point that might be something that more deeply looked into to answer a lot of the questions we had about option that was set out for number 4 for moving to 6th grade.
Thank you. Okay, we've got one more, group 6, which is Steve and Katie and
I got that this time. We talked a lot about the middle management efficiencies as well, and the cost-effective mindset in terms of faculty wearing multiple hats if they are not directly working with children. and we asked a lot of questions that Steve was very gracious to answer. We talked more very briefly at the end about the high school recommendation and how it's kind of parallel to the merger study, because the merger study is currently the entire district or nothing, not just possibly merging high schools. We spent a long time talking about middle management efficiency.
So it's a couple minutes past 8:15, which is when we said we would end, and I did capture all of these notes. I guess I was just thinking of a couple things. One, I think are you still around, Patrick, and able to, do you see Patrick? There, okay. Patrick, can you, I know you're hanging in there. Could you just remind us if we know when we might hear a little bit more from Nate Levinson and his team on what, so one thing I heard a lot of is like, what is cost effectiveness mindset? What does that look like? And I know that work is just beginning, but could you maybe share with us when we might hear a little more about that?
Sure, and I can define just beginning as well. We had our kickoff meeting today with Nate and Carla with the admin team to really start down the path of understanding what does cost effectiveness mindset and bounded autonomy look like within MAUSD specifically. And it's really a several month process through next fall that we'll be working with Nate to do that work. We're still in talks with Nate about when exactly it makes the most sense for him to talk with the board and others about where we are in that process. Probably nothing before the August board retreat. And certainly sometime in the fall as we have greater clarity and we start sort of putting some things into action in anticipation of the following year. That's the important piece, is this just sort of the lag of understanding this and talking about ways we can achieve the efficiencies through a cost effectiveness mindset and bounded autonomy. It's really all work in anticipation of FY24. So not next school year, but the year after. But yeah, thinking about as early as the August retreat.
And then the other thing that I was thinking about, which a lot of questions came up around the different options in the report and from the board. So that's kind of the management administrative work is on that bounded autonomy, cost effectiveness mindset. And then the board is doing community engagement, as folks may know, starting with conversations using the thought exchange platform that mirror like what we did tonight. And that's really our first work on trying to make sense of some of those other options and getting input from people on those. So we are still sort of at the beginning stages of all of this. So I guess that's...
Krista, could I ask a clarifying question? You
Yeah.
just used the phrase bounded autonomy, and that jumped out at me somewhere. Can you explain what is the bounded autonomy philosophy? Is that when I was, or is anyone able to define that? That was a new phrase.
Want to give it a stab, Patrick? Bounded autonomy.
Sure. It's really about, so there's complete autonomy, right? So each school under the leadership of its building principal doing whatever it decides to do. The challenge there is maintaining equity when you have complete autonomy. The idea of bounded autonomy is a way to collectively and collaboratively identify a set of rules that all schools would follow as each school takes on more autonomy for some decision making. So that's the bounded part of bounded autonomy, is that we're bound by this collective set of rules that we create together with the expertise of Nate and Carla. And that's sort of the part of the work that will take, several months working with Nate and Carla to really flesh out those rules and understand their implications.
Thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts before we conclude this part of our conversation?
Just that, I know the report, Levinson's report, the detailed report is on the website somewhere if you haven't looked at it, and he literally has a section defining from his perspective, like, I was just finding it, bounded autonomy, all the different stuff, and so I find it's always useful to go back to this very sort of rich report to kind of get a sort of sense of what direction we're going, our next steps.
If you just go to the MAUSD.org website, go to the school board, and then the facilities planning link. It's right at the top of that page.
Awesome.
Is there anything else on people's minds that they want to bring up now while we're talking about this? Okay. So I'll be sure to share these notes out with everybody. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Especially the executive highlights.
Sorry?
I especially need executive highlights.
Well, you have to wait and see what they tell you.
Well, we know, but like even some of the things that we're
Well, they'll be attached in the minutes as well.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. I want to make sure they're consistent.
Yep. So what you do is send them to Krista and Patrick and I, and we all look at them and then.
Okay. And then you add it.
Yeah. So it's sort of a group.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. My daughter's touchscreen. And I think just the technology is just more temperamental with the issue. And now it's better again. She was very tempted to send it in, but she was like,
We have a few things to finish in here, and then we have a little executive session. All right. You guys are going up just like
My friend, good to see you.
So we have a few more things to finish up. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
All right. So, is there any public comment at this time? All right. Before we go into executive session, I think we can do our evaluation. Then when we're done with our executive session, we can just adjourn, and that would be the only, Sean doesn't have to wait for us. All right. Are you able to do that?
I am. All right, what is the level of engagement of all board members, high or low?
Aye.
Was the agenda followed, yes or no?
Yes.
yes, with modifications. Well, yes, with modifications. We were
We
ahead
had
of
to hop around,
ourselves.
but we got
In a
we
good
didn't
way.
very often go off into any other unknown.
We're very efficient with it.
Yeah, in a good way.
Does the chair effectively establish the agenda and materials for distribution to the board?
Yes.
Any comments?
Still appreciate the notes, thank you.
Yes. You're welcome.
Is the chair effective in fostering a professional culture regarding fair and open deliberations, full participation of all members, and ensuring the integrity of the board process, yes or no?
Yes.
Any comments? Other feedback for the chair? Y'all want real cake to go with that cake?
That was brilliant. Thank you.
What went well with the meeting?
Really productive conversations.
Yeah.
Great conversation.
What suggestions do you have for ways to improve future meetings?
Cake.
Is that the last question?
More taste
That's the last one.
Okay, so we usually go over meeting highlights, and Sandy's going to be doing them, so if we just want to give her some key points that we want to mention in our meeting highlights. now would be a good time.
I was going to say the cake analogy, so I'm putting it out there. I thought it was great.
I would put out some concern about the number of resignations and the difficulty in hiring folks. That's not a highlight, but it's
And the challenges.
a big challenge.
It's everywhere. I think the robustness of the conversations we had tonight was a real highlight.
All right. Good. Sounds like that she's got enough to go on. All right, so, Chris, if you just copy me on the minutes, I'll add in the end times and all that. We are in need of an executive session under Title I, VSA 5, 313A3, evaluation of an employee. It's our superintendent check-in. I know we just did one last month, but that's because we missed another one, so we're getting back on the regular schedule. So, is there a motion to go into executive session and invite Patrick?
I second.
Krista and Sandy. All right. All those in favor of going into executive session under Title I, VSA 5, 313A3, evaluation of an employee, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, 8:26 we're in.